Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be from the 12th chapter of Ecclesiastes. And the formula that I've selected in anticipation of this otherwise extemporaneous exegesis is we're going to proceed from some biographical context, then from that foundation go into some literary context, then delve into the actual text itself, because I believe the two predecessors of the actual analysis are necessary in order to enrich that which I intend to communicate. Now, the author of Ecclesiastes was Solomon, and I think the most appropriate review for this can be found in the 3rd chapter of Kings. There we read of a 19-year-old Solomon who's recently ascended to the throne of the united country of Israel. And he's visited by Elohim in a dream, and he's given an unprecedented opportunity. He can have anything he wants, a blank slate, literally anything he wants in prayer. And cognizant of the awful task before him of ruling so great a people, and given his youth and inexperience, he admits that he's bereft of the wisdom to do so. So he asks for such, and the father not only grants his request, but he was so pleased by the answer of what he didn't ask for, that he actually gives him what he didn't ask for, which was prosperity and power to unprecedented degrees. And we read of an application of this wisdom in the famous trial of the mother, who were brought to him before in judgment, arguing over which mother is the rightful owner of the baby. And then we read of some of the extent of his polymath, to what extent he was. He was a zoologist and author of 3,000 proverbs. Now, the book of Proverbs contains approximately 678. I'm not exactly sure if that's the exact number, but I'm just going on memory. But the 4th chapter of the book of Kings tells us that he was the author of 4,000 proverbs. So that just shows that not everything in the Bible is everything that these people had to offer. And then we read of an application of the wisdom combined with that wealth in the utilization of the construction of the temple in the 6th through 8th chapter of 1st Kings. And also significant, I feel, is we read that he's paid homage by a foreign dignitary, the Queen of Sheba, who visits him investigating his wisdom and is left speechless. But then in the 11th chapter, I also should have mentioned that he also gave him a conditional promise in the 3rd chapter of Kings, whereby which he would be prolonged long life inasmuch as he remained in obedience. And then abruptly and suddenly and without warning, in the 11th chapter of Kings, we read that he has 700 wives and 300 concubines, mostly of foreign origin, who ultimately lead him to idolatrous pagan worships. And Solomon ultimately expires at the age of 59. True to his word, Elohim does honor the promise, but that's a negative promise, and can't say he wasn't warned. So for all his wisdom, he wasn't completely, in the final analysis, wise in his application of it, if he wanted to live longer. And we read also that the kingdom of Israel splintered in his behalf, due more to the arrogance of his son, Rehoboam, in the 12th chapter of Kings. But also, and we read of expressions of this wisdom. We have some details of the extent of his wisdom, but the ultimate expressions of his wisdom are found in the books of the Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, of which he personally wrote. Now, the book of First Kings and First Chronicles are of mysterious authorship. He's the subject of them, but he's not the author of them. He's a subject for the first 11 chapters of Kings and 10 of First Chronicles, but he's not the author of them. So we find the expression of them. Now, sometime before he expired, the book of Ecclesiastes is his mature musings. We read in the book of Proverbs that he was quite adept at the practical application of wisdom, as expressed in pithy sayings of condensed wisdom that he sought to leave on to his son and ultimately posterity. But in Ecclesiastes, we find him expressing the frustration. To summarize the subsequent text in a slogan, it would be the frequently recited expression, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. He questions the wisdom of owning all the wealth when it's going to be squandered by an unworthy successor. Rehoboam was quite clearly not of the same caliber of man or king that he was. And he also questions the eternal efficacy of wisdom. If it's, to some extent, he's passing it on to posterity, but he's also questioning, what does it mean? What does it gain him in the long run? And we do find a conclusion. So up to this point, the most conclusive answer is non-conclusive, but we finally find a conclusion in the 12th chapter, and we're going to touch on that. The first verse reads, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near where you say, I have no pleasure in them." Now, a concordance is definitely a highly recommended secondary source whereby you can list every word that's listed in the English language, and if you go to the right of them, you'll find their numbers, and you can turn to the back of the text and find the Hebrew or Greek meanings of those words, which really not only enriches your understanding of the original language, but often exposes the limitations of the English language. And in this specific instance, in the first word, we learn remember is not nearly a strong enough word in the English language. The Hebrew word, of which I wouldn't even attempt to pronounce if I even remembered the spelling, entails more than merely not forgetting. It really entails holding him as the primary priority, keeping him first in your heart, first priority. It means having him be at the center of all your thoughts and all your being and all your doing. So again, remember really isn't a strong enough word for what the author is intending to communicate. And this exposes the two sides of the balance that we believers are implicitly to cultivate, of having fair weather faith in the days of adversity and poverty and misery and death and decay, being complemented by the fair weather faith, having a lot of people are only faithful in as much as they are prosperous. Or this is ultimately the argument that Satan gave to encourage God's petition against Job, because Satan argued was only prosperous in as much as he was blessed. But as we see, even though the adversary was permitted by the Father to take away everything except his life, and Job ultimately satisfies the Father's implicit trust in his faith. But it's really more to the point of what we as believers are to cultivate. I think developing the faith in the days of winter prepares us for the days of spring and the summer of the faith. Don't anyone ever let you tell you that the Christian life is a life of all roses, because let me tell you, it's not. We're called to suffer. We're called to endure. We're to be all but virtually guaranteed to be ridiculed, mocked, etc., etc. So don't let anyone tell you. There's a lot of people running around TV, the prosperity gospel heretics. They got it all wrong, let me tell you. Couldn't be more wrong. I'm not going to delve into their peculiar perversion or their own heresy, but it suffices to say that they are heretics. Moving on, before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. In the days when the guards of the house tremble, and the strong men shall bow down, when the grinders shall cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows shall become dim, and the door shall be shut in the street, and the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are bowed down. These are essentially expressions of mortality given in the twilight of life. He's very much aware that life is perhaps he's reached maybe of the opinion that it's a passing show and there's nothing to look forward to after it. Furthermore, they are afraid of what is high and of low places in the way, and the almond tree blossoms, and the grasshoppers become a burden, and desire perishes. For man is going to his everlasting home, and the mourner shall go about the street. Now, I just noticed something. This is a reminder that always, always, always use the text as the primary molder of your analysis, because if you type in Corey Johnston, Ecclesiastes 3 on the YouTube tape, you'll see in the exegesis that I give on that chapter, I essentially regurgitate an insight I acquired secondhand that Solomon is writing as if there is no resurrection in mind. And perhaps the subsequent chapters may appear to suggest that. But the everlasting home, that word just popped out right at me. That's a reminder that never let anyone else's analysis taint your own. Ultimately, seek the prayer in spirit, and he will answer, because the prayer for wisdom is wholly commensurate with the will of the Father, and he wants us to be wise. He wants us to know what he wants to tell us. So always seek the Spirit out in prayer. Use secondhand sources, but as secondhand sources. So really hold that in order. Don't stop following me or anything, because I got a lot to say that could maybe enrich your own. But ultimately, always return to the text. Lesson learned right there. Completely improvised and unexpected. Before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the jar shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to Elohim, who gave it. So essentially, we read in Genesis 2:7 that Adam was created from the dust. So there's really nothing special about our biological composition, physically speaking. But what makes us distinct from the animals, we read, is that we're made in the image of the Father. And the precise details, the data is, you're not going to find out anything as to precisely what that means, though there are a variety of hypotheses, the most convincing of which I believe is spirituality. Man alone has the capacity to contemplate and to have fellowship with the divine. Vanity, vanity, says the Qoleth. All is vanity. Again, that's the summary, once more reiterated at this point, appropriately enough. And besides being wise, Qoleth also taught the people knowledge, and he listened and sought out. Laid in order many proverbs. We've already mentioned that he authored the book of Proverbs, which were ultimately but a fraction of those that he conceived. But he was clearly adept at the art of writing proverbs. Qoleth sought to find out words of delight and words of truth, rightly written. The words of the wise are like goads, and as nail driven by the master of the collection. They were given by one shepherd. Now, shepherd is a term that was used by the Hebrews, who were an agricultural people, that signified anyone of leadership who was of secular or religious leadership. Solomon's father, for instance, we read in the 78th Psalm and elsewhere in Scripture, but that he was taken from the sheepfolds into the to become the pastor of God, and the very term employed by Christians as pastors denotes the agriculturally rooted analogy of leadership. So this is the divine shepherd. You can read in John 10 all about what that office precisely entails. And besides these, my son, be warned, the making of many books has no end, and much study is a weary of flesh. So he's ultimately frustrated by what he finds the futility of accumulating knowledge or wisdom. Ultimately, he sees it as a species of vanity almost, because what is it gained his eternal or immortal self? Ultimately, all he can do is leave behind the tidbits he acquired and communicate it to posterity in the hopes that they maybe live life the way that the Father intends them to, and as he somewhat failed to in the final analysis, as we read. And this is the conclusion of the book right here. So the subsequent passage is really the most conclusive answer is non-conclusive. We read of a man's quest to find the meaning of life, and he's frustrated. But this is significant right here. Let us hear the conclusion of the entire matter. Fear Elohim and guard his commands, for this is to all mankind. Now, wisdom can assist you in your day-to-day living, but ultimately the most spiritually satisfying state is the state of obedience. Now, there are many things in this book that I do not understand, but I'm not told that I have to understand it. I'm told I am to believe. And anybody can believe. A blind man can believe. A deaf person can believe. An old person can believe. A young person can believe. And that word believe means commit. I commit my life totally to him. And 100% emphatically, that's admittedly an exalted standard, impossible to maintain 100% of the time, but one worth aspiring to. So I may have overstepped myself somewhat there. And the final verse reads, "For Elohim shall bring every work into justice, including all that is hidden, whether good or evil." So ultimately, we all have to answer for the life that we lived on this earth. And I can't tell you how the judgment's going to end, but I do have faith that it will all be just. Stay tuned next time. Thanks so much.